Welcome, dear readers, to a journey through time and the human soul. Prepare to venture into the misty streets of Paris in the winter of 1943, where the echo of war still resonates among the ancient stones, and where a woman named Madeleine will teach us that sometimes it's necessary to lose everything to find oneself. Imagine a woman sitting at the same cafe table every day for 3 years, waiting for someone who may never return. What would you do if you discovered that this wait was built upon a lie? This is the story of Meline Rouso and how she transformed betrayal into freedom, pain into dignity, and waiting into a new beginning. And you, dear listeners, from where do you accompany us on this journey? Leave in the comments the city that shelters you while you listen to this story of rebirth. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Each gesture from you here is like a rose left on the table of a Parisian cafe, small but full of meaning. Year 1943-1953. City, Paris, France. Le Marais district. The winter of 1943 dragged through the streets of Paris like a reluctant ghost, leaving traces of fog between the buildings that still bore the scars of occupation. At Café Étoile, a small establishment in the Le Marais district, life continued its unhurried rhythm, punctuated by the discreet tinkling of porcelain cups and the whisper of newspaper pages being turned. Meline Rouso arrived punctually at 3 in the afternoon, as if it were a sacred ritual. At 39 years old, she seemed to carry an extra decade on her curved shoulders, in her measured walk, in her contained gestures. Her dark brown hair was always pulled back in a low bun, held by a dark wooden hairpin that had belonged to her grandmother. The grey wool coat, already faded at the elbows, had accompanied her since before the war, as had the black leather gloves she never removed, even inside the cafe. The hat with dark ribbon was her silent emblem of mourning, not official mourning, but that which she herself had decreed for a life that seemed suspended in time. Suzanne, the establishment's waitress, a 60-year-old woman with rough hands and a generous heart, no longer asked what she desired. She simply brought a cup of black coffee, without sugar, which Madeleine never drank. The table by the window had become her extension, her observation post of the world that continued turning while she remained motionless. The wrought-iron tables and wicker chairs creaked softly under the weight of other customers, but hers remained silent, as if the furniture itself respected the almost sacred nature of her vigil. Pierre Dubois. The name resonated in her mind like a whispered prayer. Artillery officer, fiancé, man who had departed for war with promises on his lips and an engagement ring in his uniform pocket. 3 years. 3 winters had passed since the last letter, since the last concrete hope. But Madeleine continued there, faithful as an abandoned lighthouse that still lights its beacon every night. The ring on her ring finger had left a clearer mark on her skin, a small silver scar that she unconsciously caressed while observing passers-by through the fogged glass. Women with children in their arms, men bent by the weight of invisible luggage, all heading toward destinations she couldn't imagine. Suzanne approached with the coffee, the same ritual as always. She placed the cup on the saucer with almost reverent care, as if it were an offering on a particular altar. Madeleine nodded slightly, a silent thanks that had been repeated for 1,000 days. "Madame Rouso," murmured Suzanne, her voice laden with cautious tenderness. "Monsieur Moreau is asking if he can occupy the table next to yours. He says he's a photographer." Madeleine raised her eyes for the first time that afternoon. A tall man in a dark coat worn at the shoulders held an old camera between his hands as if it were a sacred object. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of curiosity and melancholy, that made her nod almost imperceptibly. Henri Moreau sat at the neighboring table but didn't order anything. He simply remained there, organizing his photographs on the iron surface, small fragments of black and white that seemed to contain entire worlds. Madeleine pretended not to notice, but each movement of his was like a stone thrown into the calm surface of her inner lake. The winter sun began to slant, tinting the cafe windows with a golden and melancholic light. And it was then that Henri turned toward her, holding a photograph between his fingers. "Forgive me, madam," he said, his voice rough as if it hadn't been used for a long time. "But I believe this image might interest you." Madeleine felt something icy descend down her spine, as if a terrible premonition was about to materialize. The photograph trembled between Henri's fingers, like a dry leaf about to be carried by the wind. Madeleine extended her hand, and in that simple gesture 3 years of waiting found their definitive end. It was Pierre. There was no doubt whatsoever. The same smile he had carried with him to war, the same eyes she had memorized in every detail. But beside him, a woman with peasant features smiled with a naturalness that cut Madeline's heart like a sharp blade. And in her arms, a child of approximately 3 years, the same age as Pierre's absence. The world seemed to tilt dangerously. The voices in the cafe transformed into a distant murmur, as if she were submerged in deep waters. Suzanne, who observed the scene from afar, approached with cautious steps, sensing that something fundamental was unraveling before her eyes. Where? Madeline's voice emerged as a broken whisper. Where was this photograph taken? Henri Moreau leaned slightly, his eyes laden with a compassion he tried to disguise with professionalism. Ukraine, madame. Poltava region. Approximately 6 months ago. He paused, as if weighing each word. This man. Is he important to you? Madeleine didn't respond immediately. Her fingers traced the contour of the photograph, touching Pierre's face as if she could, through the paper, reach the man who had departed and never returned. But this wasn't the Pierre she had kept in memory. This man in the photograph had built a new life, complete, while she remained crystallized in time. He was my fiancé. The words came out fragmented, like pieces of glass. Pierre Dubois, artillery officer. Missing for 3 years. Henri nodded slowly, and in his eyes Madeleine could see that he knew this story better than she would wish. Madame, I'm very sorry, but there are things you need to know. He hesitated, clearly struggling with himself. Pierre Dubois isn't missing. He chose to stay. The word struck Madeleine like an avalanche. Chose to stay. He wasn't captured, wasn't wounded, wasn't prevented by tragic circumstances of war. He simply chose a different life, with a different woman in a place where Meline Rouso didn't exist. Suzanne approached even closer, her rough hands gently resting on Madeleine's trembling shoulders. The entire café seemed to hold its breath, as if even strangers sensed they were witnessing a moment of intimate devastation. The child, Madeleine could barely pronounce the words. He's 3 years old, Henri confirmed, his voice low and respectful. Born there. Pierre registered him as his son. The engagement ring on her finger suddenly weighed like an anchor. 3 years. 3 years waiting for a man who had built a family on the other side of the world. 3 years measuring her life in untouched cups of coffee and increasingly fragile hopes. Madeleine slowly straightened, with the wounded but still intact dignity of one who discovered she had lived within a lie. She held the photograph against her chest, not as a treasure but as evidence she needed to carry. Thank you, monsieur. Her voice sounded strangely serene. Moreau. Henri Moreau. He also stood, clearly uncomfortable with the role he had played. Thank you, Monsieur Moreau, for returning me to reality. And with those words, Meline Rouso walked toward the door of Café Étoile, leaving behind an untouched cup of coffee and 3 years of a life that had never truly existed. Henri remained watching her silhouette disappear into the Parisian winter mist, carrying with him a strange mixture of guilt and admiration for that woman's dignity. Suzanne collected the abandoned cup, and for the first time in 3 years, Madeleine's coffee was completely cold. The following days dragged like open wounds. Madeleine didn't return to Café Étoile, but she also couldn't remain in her small apartment on Rue des Martyrs, where every object seemed to echo with memories of Pierre. The hand mirror he had given her, the yellowed letters kept in a wooden box, the blue dress she had reserved for the day of his return, everything had transformed into instruments of silent torture. It was on Thursday morning that she decided to seek out Marcel Fontaine, the editor for whom Pierre wrote before the war. If anyone knew the complete truth, it would be he. The office was near the Latin Quarter, in a grey stone building where the smell of printing ink mixed with the aroma of tobacco and aged paper. Marcel was a 60-year-old man, well-trimmed greyish beard and small eyes behind gold-framed glasses. When Madeleine entered his office, he recognized her immediately. He had received her a few times when she came to look for Pierre in peacetime. "Madeleine," he said, rising from the desk filled with manuscripts. "What a surprise. Please, sit down." She remained standing, holding her black leather purse as if it were an anchor. Henri's photograph was inside it. along with all the questions that had tormented her in recent days. "Marcel, I need to know the truth about Pierre." Her voice sounded firmer than she expected. "The whole truth." The editor sighed deeply, removing his glasses and cleaning them with a white handkerchief. It was evident he had feared this moment for a long time. "Sit down, Meline. This conversation won't be easy." She finally settled into the cracked leather chair in front of the desk, her hands perfectly folded in her lap, as she always did when preparing for difficult news. "Pierre didn't disappear in the war," Marcel began, his voice laden with discomfort. "He deserted voluntarily." The word struck Madeleine like a second wave of revelation. Desertion. Not just abandonment, but cowardice. The man for whom she had waited 3 years had fled from his responsibilities, both military and personal. "When?" she asked, surprising herself with her own calm. "At the end of 1940, he was stationed near the Ukrainian border. The last information I received—" Marcel hesitated, clearly struggling with the words. "He became involved with a local woman, a widow with resources. He didn't just become involved, Madeleine. He married her. He assumed her property, the family business." Madeleine briefly closed her eyes. Each revelation was like a layer of varnish being removed, exposing the rotten wood beneath. "And the child?" "It's his," Marcel confirmed gently. "Born in 1941. Pierre officially recognized him. In the eyes of local law, he's a married man and family father." The silence that followed was dense as melted lead. Madeleine could hear the tick-tock of the clock on the wall, the muffled voices from the street below, the creak of the chair when Marcel moved uncomfortably. Did he write anything, send any explanation?" Marcel opened a desk drawer and removed a yellowed envelope. He extended it to Madeleine with visible reluctance. "It arrived in 1941. I never knew if I should deliver it or not. I thought maybe it would be better to let you keep your hopes." Madeleine took the envelope with surprisingly steady hands. Her name was written in Pierre's familiar handwriting, but there was something different in the writing, a haste, a casualness she had never seen before. She opened it right there, in front of Marcel. The letter was brief, almost insulting in its brevity. "Madeleine, I found a new life here. I won't return to Paris. Forget me as I forgot you. P. 10 words. 3 years of waiting destroyed in 10 words, written with the same consideration one would dedicate to a note for the baker." Madeleine carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. When she raised her eyes to Marcel, there was a terrible clarity in them, as if a thick fog had finally dissipated. "Thank you, Marcel, for everything." She stood, adjusted her hat, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "If he ever returns looking for me, tell him that Meline Rouso died in the winter of 1943. Tell him she was buried alongside his lies." And with those words, she left the office, carrying with her not only the devastating truth, but also, for the first time in 3 years, the strange and disturbing sensation of being completely free. The return to Café Étoile occurred on a Friday afternoon, when the light filtered through the fogged windows created dancing shadows over the wrought-iron tables. Madeleine entered as she always had, with measured steps and erect posture. But something fundamental had changed. Suzanne perceived it immediately. It was as if the woman entering was a sharper version of the one who had left days before, as if someone had adjusted the focus of a blurred photograph. The table by the window awaited her as always, but this time Madeleine didn't head directly toward it. She stopped in the middle of the café, observing the environment with eyes that seemed to see everything for the first time. The whispered conversations, the steam rising from cups, the way afternoon light fragmented through the glass. Everything seemed different when observed by the eyes of a woman who had just awakened from a 3-year dream. Suzanne approached cautiously, as if fearing that any sudden movement might break the strange serenity emanating from Madeleine. "The usual coffee, madame?" Madeleine looked at the waitress, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. Suzanne had deep wrinkles around her eyes, hands stained by constant work, a hesitant smile that spoke of genuine kindness, cultivated through decades of small, caring gestures. "Yes, Suzanne, but this time, bring me a small pastry as well." "Any will do." Suzanne blinked, surprised. In 3 years, Madeleine had never ordered anything besides the coffee she never drank. "Certainly, madame. We have some delicious petit fours today." Madeline headed to her usual table, but didn't sit immediately. She remained standing, observing the wicker chair that had been her silent companion on 1,000 afternoons of waiting. With a deliberate gesture, she removed the black leather gloves she always wore. It was the first time in years that her hands were exposed in the café. When she finally sat, she removed the yellowed envelope Marcel had given her and placed it on the table, beside where her cup would be in moments. Her bare hands touched the paper with a strangeness that surprised her. It was as if they belonged to another person. Suzanne returned with the coffee and a small white porcelain plate containing a petit four covered in pale pink glaze. She placed everything on the table with the same reverent care as always, but her eyes couldn't help but notice the subtle changes. The exposed hands, the envelope, the way Madeline held her head slightly more erect. "Suzanne," Madeline said softly, "how long have you worked at this café?" The question took the waitress by surprise. In 3 years, they had exchanged only polite greetings and whispered orders. 15 years, madame, since my husband died. Monsieur Etoile gave me a chance when no one else would." Madeline nodded slowly, as if registering important information. Then, with a movement that surprised both of them, she raised the coffee cup to her lips and took a sip. The liquid was bitter, strong, hot. It was the first time in 3 years she had tasted the coffee she had religiously ordered. "It's delicious," she said, and there was sincerity in her voice. Suzanne smiled, a smile that illuminated her tired face. She moved away to attend other customers, but continued watching Madeline from the corner of her eye, as if witnessing something extraordinary. Madeline opened the envelope and read Pierre's letter once more. "Forget me as I forgot you." The words no longer hurt. They had lost their power over her. They were just ink on paper, symbols describing the smallness of a man she had loved more than he ever deserved. With slow and deliberate gestures, she tore the letter into small fragments. Not with rage, but with the meticulousness of one dismantling a mechanism that no longer needs to function. Each piece fell onto the cup's saucer, creating a small pile of white paper, decorated with the familiar handwriting. Then something extraordinary happened. Madeline smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile, but genuine. And with that smile came the understanding that she was truly free. Not just from Pierre, but from the entire version of herself she had built around waiting for him. She took another sip of coffee, then cut a small piece of the petit four. The sweet taste contrasted pleasantly with the coffee's bitterness, creating a harmony she hadn't experienced in years. It was as if her taste buds had come back to life. Outside, the Parisian afternoon continued its natural course. People passed hurriedly, each carrying their own stories, their own weights, their own liberations. And for the first time in 3 years, Meline Rouso felt part of that flow, no longer an island of immobility in a sea of movement. When she finished the coffee, all the coffee, she called Suzanne. "I'll return tomorrow," she said, "but perhaps I'll try tea or hot chocolate. There are so many possibilities, don't you think?" Henri Moreau returned to Café Etoile on a Monday afternoon, when the fine March rain drummed softly on the windows. He carried the same old camera and a leather bag full of photographs, but there was something different in his bearing, a hesitation that hadn't existed before, as if he wasn't sure he would be welcome. Madeline was at her usual table, but no longer motionless like a statue. She was leafing through a book, The Flowers of Evil by Baudelaire, and occasionally raised a cup of hot chocolate to her lips. When she saw him enter, she didn't immediately look away, as she had before. Instead, she studied his face with frank curiosity that made him stop midway between the door and the tables. "Monsieur Moreau," she said, her voice clearer than he remembered, "would you like to join me?" Henri hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by the invitation. When he approached the table, he could perceive the subtle changes. She no longer wore the black gloves, her hair was slightly looser, and there was a kind of light in her eyes that had been absent before. "I don't want to disturb you, madame," he said, but was already pulling the chair from the neighboring table. "You don't disturb me. In fact, I'd like to thank you." Madeline closed the book, keeping her finger marking the page. "Your photograph freed me from a prison I had built myself." Henri sat slowly, placing the camera on the table with the care of one handling something sacred. Suzanne approached almost immediately, as if she already knew she needed to bring coffee for the man with melancholic eyes. "I'm not sure I should feel good about that," Henri said. "I brought you pain." "You brought me truth," Madeleine corrected. And truth, however painful, is always a gift. They remained silent while Suzanne served Henri's coffee. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but one full of possibilities, like the pause between movements of a symphony. "May I ask how you obtained that photograph?" Madeleine finally asked. Henri stirred the sugar in his coffee with slow and thoughtful movements. There was something in his gestures that spoke of a man accustomed to solitude, but not embittered by it. "I'm a war correspondent, or was," he corrected himself. "After the war ended, I continued traveling, documenting the aftermath. Reconstruction, lives moving forward, scars that remain." "And Pierre, how did you find him?" "By chance. I was documenting refugee families who had settled in Ukraine. He introduced himself as Pierre Dubois, local property owner, businessman." Henri paused, choosing words carefully. There was something about him that bothered me. A falseness in his smile, a hurry to get away when I asked questions about his previous life. Madeleine nodded, recognizing the description. She knew well that tendency of Pierre's to avoid conversations that might reveal inconvenient aspects of his personality. "But you didn't know who I was when you first came here?" "No," Henri admitted. "I came to the café by recommendation. Suzanne is a distant cousin of a man I met during the war. He said this was a place where lost people sometimes find themselves." Madeleine looked at Suzanne, who was organizing bottles behind the counter. The waitress intercepted her gaze and smiled slightly, as if keeping gentle secrets about all who frequented her café. "And when you saw me here, did you immediately know that I was her?" "Not immediately, but there was something in your posture, in the way you held your hands, in the manner you looked out the window." Henri hesitated. "I recognized the body language of waiting. It's something you learn to identify when documenting wars." Madeleine took a sip of hot chocolate, savoring not just the flavor, but the sensation of being genuinely present in the conversation. It was the first time in years she had talked with someone about something that wasn't Pierre or his absence. "And you? Do you have someone waiting for you somewhere?" The question took Henri off guard. He lowered his eyes to the cup, as if he could find the answer at the bottom of the coffee. "I had. Once." His voice was low, laden with an ancient sadness. "Marie. She died during a bombing in London, where she was working as a nurse. I was in Africa when it happened." "I'm sorry," Madeleine said, and there was sincerity in her compassion. "It was a long time ago. I learned that pain, when completely accepted, can transform into something different. Not exactly happiness, but a kind of peace." They looked at each other across the table, two survivors of different types of war, recognizing in each other something that didn't need to be explained. Outside, the rain continued its soft percussion, creating an atmosphere of intimacy within the café. "Monsieur Moreau," Madeleine finally said, "would you like to walk with me? When the rain stops, of course." Henri smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had seen on his face. "It would be an honor, Madame Rouso." And so, without proclamations or promises, without excessive analysis of what was happening, two wounded hearts found in each other the possibility of something new. Not love at first sight, not overwhelming passion, but something perhaps more valuable, companionship on the journey toward a future neither could yet imagine. The first walk occurred on an April afternoon, when Paris lazily awakened from winter. Madeleine and Henri walked along the Seine's banks without hurry, like two flaneurs rediscovering the city they thought they knew. She had changed the grey coat for a navy blue one, and her hair, always severely pulled back before, now framed her face in soft waves. They walked in silence most of the time, but it was companionable silence, punctuated only by the sounds of the city resurging. Street vendors announcing their wares, children's laughter in the parks, the river's constant murmur. It was during this walk that Madeleine did something that surprised her as much as Henri. She stopped in front of a florist and bought a single red rose. She held it as they continued walking, turning it between her fingers as if making an important decision. "Henri," she finally said when they reached the Pont Neuf, "this rose, I've been keeping it for 3 years." He stopped and looked at her, confused. She smiled at his expression. Not physically, of course, but in memory. "It was to be my gift for Pierre when he returned. Red rose, symbol of love that waited." She paused, looking at the flower. "But I realized I can't give someone something that actually belongs to me." With a sudden and decisive gesture, she extended the rose toward Henri. "Accept it." not as a symbol of something that never was, but as a symbol of a new beginning. Henri took the rose with careful hands, as if holding something extraordinarily fragile. There was something deeply symbolic in that gesture. Madeleine wasn't simply giving away a flower, but freeing herself from the weight of a promise she had made to a ghost. The following days established a gentle routine between them. Henri appeared at Café Étoile on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, always with his camera, always with stories he told in low voices, while Madeleine listened with an attention she didn't know she still possessed. He spoke of distant places, of people he had photographed, of moments captured at the exact instant they transformed into memory. It was on one of those afternoons that Georges Lemaire appeared. Madeleine recognized him immediately, war correspondent, man who had occasionally worked with Pierre before the desertion. Tall, thin, with prematurely greying hair and a way of walking that suggested constant haste, even when there was no urgency. He entered the café looking around with the air of someone seeking someone specific. When his eyes found Madeleine, he hesitated visibly before approaching. "Madame Rouso," he said, removing his hat. "May I speak with you? It's about Pierre Dubois." The name still had power over her, but no longer the devastating power of before. It was like an old scar that still bothers when touched, but no longer causes sharp pain. Henri, who was sitting at the neighboring table organizing photographs, perceived the immediate tension and prepared to discreetly withdraw. But Madeleine made an almost imperceptible gesture for him to stay. "Speak, Monsieur le Maire." Georges looked nervously at Henri, then back at Madeleine. "It's delicate. Pierre is returning to Paris." The silence that followed was tense as a violin string. Madeleine felt something cold move in her stomach, but it was no longer terror or desperate hope. It was anger, pure, clarifying anger. "When?" Her voice came out controlled, but Henri could perceive the tension beneath the apparent calm. "Next week. He lost his wife in Ukraine. Typhoid fever. And the business failed. He's returning because he has nothing left there." Madeleine processed this information with a coldness that surprised her. Pierre was returning not from nostalgia, not from love, not from remorse. He was returning because his other options had been exhausted. Typical. And he thinks he can simply resume the life he left behind? Georges seemed even more uncomfortable. He asked me to find you, to prepare the way, so to speak. He said he still loves you, that the years away made him realize what he lost. Henri saw Madeleine's jaw tighten slightly, the only external sign of the storm raging within her. "Monsieur le Maire," she said finally, her voice dangerously calm, "I want you to deliver a message to Pierre Dubois." "Certainly, madame." Madeleine took a sheet of paper from her purse and a pen. She wrote quickly, folded the paper once, and handed it to Georges. "Deliver this to him personally, and make sure he understands it's my final word." Georges took the paper with evident reluctance, clearly curious about its contents, but lacking the courage to ask. After he left, Henri leaned slightly forward. "May I ask what you wrote?" Madeleine smiled, and there was fierce satisfaction in her expression. "I wrote, 'There is no place for you here, Monsieur Rousseau.'" She paused. 10 words, exactly the same number he used to discard me 3 years ago. Henri nodded with silent approval. There was poetic justice in that symmetry, an elegance in how she had closed the circle. And if he insists on seeking you out, then he'll discover that the woman he left no longer exists, Madeleine said simply. She died in the winter of 1943, remember, and what was born in her place has no time for ghosts from the past. That night, for the first time in years, Madeleine slept deeply, without dreams of familiar faces or broken promises. She dreamed of cameras and red roses, of rainy afternoons and conversations by rivers. She dreamed of a future that was truly hers. Henri's studio was in an attic above a bookstore on Rue de Rivoli, accessible by a narrow wooden staircase that creaked softly underfoot. Madeleine climbed the steps with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity, carrying a small bouquet of violets she had bought along the way, not from obligation or tradition, but simply because she liked their colors. The space was Spartan but welcoming. Large north-facing windows allowed natural light to flood the environment softly and constantly. There were no unnecessary luxuries, a wooden table marked by use, some simple chairs, photographic equipment organized with military precision, and on the walls, dozens of black and white photographs that told silent stories of people and places. Henri received her with a hesitant smile, clearly nervous about having a visitor in his personal space. There was something vulnerable about seeing him there, among his creations, as if each photograph on the walls were a confession. "Welcome to my sanctuary," he said, gesturing vaguely around. "It's not much, but it has good light." Madeleine walked slowly through the space, observing the photographs with genuine attention. Children playing in ruins, soldiers sleeping in trenches, women working in fields devastated by war. All captured moments of humanity amid chaos, beauty found where least expected. "They're extraordinary," she said, stopping in front of a photograph of an elderly woman sewing by a broken window. "There's so much life in them, even in the saddest ones." Henri approached, standing slightly behind her to see the photograph through her eyes. "That's Madame Dubois," he said softly. "Not your Madame Dubois, but a lady from Lyon. She lost her husband in the war, both sons too. But she continued sewing. She said that as long as her hands were busy, her heart couldn't surrender completely to sadness." Madeleine nodded, understanding perfectly. There was ancient wisdom in those words, the same wisdom that had led her to continue going to the café day after day, even when waiting had become more habit than hope. "Henri," she said, turning to face him, "I'd like you to photograph me." He seemed surprised, then worried. "I don't know if that's a good idea. My photography has already brought enough changes to your life." "Exactly for that reason," she insisted. "The photograph you showed me was of Pierre with his new life. I want a photograph of me, of my new life, an image that's truly mine." Henri studied her face, searching for signs of hesitation or doubt. He found only serene determination. "Very well, but do it your way. Sit where you feel comfortable, dress as you want to appear in the photograph." Madeleine looked around the studio and chose a corner near the window where natural light created soft shadows. She removed her navy blue coat and remained in a simple cream-colored dress that enhanced her skin without artifice. She sat in a wooden chair, but not in the rigid posture she had maintained for years. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, hands loose in her lap, face turned toward the light. "No poses," she said firmly. "No forced smiles. I want to look exactly as I am in this moment." Henri prepared his camera with economical and precise movements. There was something almost reverent in the way he handled the equipment, as if each adjustment were part of a sacred ritual. "Talk to me while I prepare the shot," he said. "About anything. I want to capture you natural, not posing." Madeleine began talking about the violets she had brought, about how she had stopped on a corner just to watch a cat warming itself in the sun, about the strange and wonderful sensation of walking through the streets without a fixed destination for the first time in years. Her voice became more relaxed, her gestures more natural. Henri worked in silence, adjusting lights, changing angles, waiting for the perfect moment. And then he saw it. An instant when Madeleine stopped talking and simply looked out the window, her face captured between memory and possibility, between what had been and what could become. The camera's click was almost silent, but Madeleine heard it like distant thunder. "Done," Henri said softly. "I think I got it. How will it be developed?" "I need a few hours in the laboratory downstairs. The bookstore has a darkroom in the basement," he hesitated. "Would you like to wait?" "I can make tea, we have books." Madeleine smiled, and it was a genuine smile without the weight of past obligations. "I'd like that very much." They spent the following hours in comfortable company. Madeleine leafed through poetry books, while Henri worked in the laboratory, occasionally coming up to check if she needed anything. When he finally brought the developed photograph, both remained silent for a long moment. The image showed a woman Madeleine recognized, but who seemed new at the same time. There were no vestiges there of tortured waiting or desperate hope. Instead, there was dignity, silent strength, and something that took her a moment to identify. There was peace. "Is this how you see me?" she asked softly. "This is how you are," Henri responded. "Perhaps it's the first time you've allowed anyone to see." And in that moment, in the attic filled with natural light and memories captured on paper, Meline Rouso completed a transformation that had begun with a devastating photograph and culminated with an image of rebirth. The letter arrived on a May morning, delivered by a street child who accepted some coins, and disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. The envelope was thick, expensive paper, and the name Meline Rouso was written in Pierre's familiar handwriting, but now she could see the arrogance even in the way he formed letters. Madeleine held the envelope for a long moment, weighing it in her hands as if she could divine its contents by touch. She was at Café Étoile, at her usual table, on a particularly quiet morning when only a few regular customers read newspapers in silence. Suzanne watched from afar, clearly worried by the expression that had appeared on her favorite customer's face. With deliberate movements, Madeleine opened the envelope. The letter was long, 3 pages of justifications, explanations, pleas. Pierre wrote about the war, about how he had been forced to make difficult decisions, about how distance had distorted his feelings. He spoke of nostalgia, regret, second chances. He promised he would be different now, that he had learned the value of what he lost. But between the honeyed words and dramatic promises, Madeleine could see the truth. Pierre was returning because he had no more options, not from love. The letter was an attempt at manipulation, a call to the woman he imagined was still the same from 3 years ago, desperate, hopeful, willing to accept any crumb of attention. The anger she had felt when Georges Lemaire brought news of his return returned now amplified. But it was no longer the destructive anger of the beginning. It was something more focused, purer. It was the anger of a woman who finally understood her own worth. Henri entered the café just as she finished reading the letter for the second time. He saw her immediately, felt the tension emanating from her like heat from an oven. He approached cautiously, saying nothing, simply sitting at the neighboring table and waiting. "He wrote," Madeleine finally said, her voice controlled but laden with emotion. 3 pages of pretty lies and empty promises. Henri nodded, understanding without need for explanations. Suzanne brought him coffee automatically, but remained nearby, clearly worried. Madeleine carefully folded the letter and placed it on the table. Then, with a sudden movement, she took the pen she always carried in her purse and began writing on the back of one of the pages. She wrote quickly, as if the words were flowing directly from her heart to paper. "Pierre, you write about second chances as if I owe you one, as if 3 years of abandonment were a simple misunderstanding, as if I were the same foolish woman you left behind. I am not. The woman who loved you died slowly, day by day, in a café in Paris, waiting for a man who had chosen to forget her existence. What was born in her place has no patience for your pleas, nor interest in your promises. You had your new life in Ukraine. Now I have mine here. Don't look for me. We no longer exist for each other. Monsieur Rousseau." When she finished, her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from a liberating energy that coursed through her entire body. It was as if each word had been a broken chain, each sentence a door closed forever. Henri read the letter over her shoulder with silent permission. When he finished, he nodded with approval. "Will you send it?" Madeleine looked at the letter, then at Henri, then at the small flames flickering under the teapot behind Suzanne's counter. A slow smile spread across her face. "No, he doesn't deserve even my anger." With deliberate movements, she tore up the letter she had written. Then, with even more care, she also tore up Pierre's letter. The paper fragments fell onto the coffee cup's saucer like confetti from a particular celebration. Suzanne approached, intrigued by the expression of fierce determination on Madeleine's face. "Suzanne, could you lend me a match?" The waitress hesitated for a moment, then reached for a box of matches used to light the candles that decorated the tables at night. Madeleine lit a match and brought it close to the paper fragments in the saucer. The fire caught slowly, first only at the edges, then spreading until it consumed every piece. Pierre's words transformed into ashes, along with her own words of anger. Thin smoke rose from the cup like incense from a particular liberation ceremony. Henri, Suzanne, and the other customers watched in respectful silence. There was something sacred in that moment, a transformation so complete it could be felt by everyone in the café. When the last flames died out, Madeleine gently blew the ashes. They scattered through the air like seeds of freedom, carried by the breeze entering through the half-open window. "Now yes," she said, turning to Henri with a radiant smile. "Now I'm truly free." And for the first time since she had entered Café Étoile years ago, Meline Rouso rose from her table without carrying the weight of any any betrayed hope, any past that needed to be avenged or forgotten. She carried only the present, light as the ashes she had blown into the air, and infinite possibilities for the future. April brought with it a transformation that went beyond the seasons. Paris awakened from its winter lethargy, with an intensity that seemed to echo Madeline's personal metamorphosis. The trees along the Seine exploded in tender green, cafes spread their tables across sidewalks, and the entire city seemed to sigh with relief after months of greyish quietude. Madeleine appeared at Café Étoile on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing something that made Suzanne blink twice to be sure she was seeing correctly. Instead of the eternal dark coat, she wore a dress of soft blue like spring sky, which enhanced her eyes and brought colour to her cheeks. Her hair, always severely pulled back before, now framed her face in loose waves that caught the afternoon light. But the most impressive change was in her bearing. Where before there had been contained hesitation, now there existed natural grace. Where before there had been resigned waiting, now there was living presence engaged with the present moment. Henri was at his usual table, organizing some photographs for an exhibition he was planning. When he saw Madeleine enter, he stopped mid-movement, clearly impacted by the transformation. "Madame Rouso," Suzanne said, approaching with a smile that illuminated her entire face. "How beautiful! You look like spring arrived with you." Madeleine laughed, a clear and genuine sound that Henri realized he had never heard before. It was as if a long-blocked fountain had finally found its way to the surface. "Suzanne, today I want to try something different," she said, sitting at her usual table but with a completely new posture, more relaxed, more present. "How about jasmine tea, and maybe some macarons if you have them?" Suzanne almost jumped with joy. In nearly 4 years serving Madeleine, this was the first time she had seen her truly experiment, truly live. Henri approached, carrying one of his photographs. "May I show you something?" It was the portrait he had taken of her some weeks before, but now framed in simple and elegant wood. The image perfectly captured that moment of transition, the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming, suspended between past and future, like a bird between branch and flight. "It turned out beautiful," Madeleine said, lightly touching the frame. "I almost don't recognize myself. Perhaps because you're seeing yourself as you really are for the first time," Henri suggested. They spent the afternoon talking about things normal people talk about, books they were reading, places they'd like to visit, childhood memories not marked by war or loss. Henri told of his fascination with natural light and how each hour of day created completely different photographic possibilities. Madeleine spoke of her old passion for botany, dormant during the years of waiting, and how she was rediscovering the pleasure of identifying plants in parks. When the sun began to slant, Henri made a suggestion that surprised both of them with its naturalness. "Would you like to walk with me to the Luxembourg Gardens? The light at this hour is perfect for photographs, and there's a section of roses that should be beginning to bloom." Madeleine didn't hesitate. "I'd love to." They walked through the streets of Paris like two old friends, or perhaps like something more, something that didn't yet have a name but was developing naturally like the flowers beginning to bloom in gardens. There was no urgency to define what was happening between them. It was enough that it was happening. In the garden, Henri photographed not just the flowers, but also Madeleine among them. Not formal poses, but moments captured when she bent to smell a rose's perfume, when she watched children playing near the pond, when she simply stood still, appreciating the beauty around her. "Henri," she said as they walked back, the sun setting in tones of gold and pink. "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me when I still couldn't see myself. For having patience with my transformation. For," she hesitated, searching for the right words, "for allowing me to rediscover who I am." Henri stopped and turned to face her. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a tenderness that went beyond friendship, but without the desperate urgency that had characterized her relationship with Pierre. "Madeleine," he said softly. "May I call you that?" She nodded, feeling that with permission to use her first name, something important was being established between them. "Madeleine, you don't need to thank me for seeing you. Anyone with functioning eyes can see what you are. The difference is that you're finally allowing them to see." That night, when Madeleine returned to her apartment, she did something she hadn't done in years. She opened all the windows so spring air could flood the rooms. She removed from a drawer a green dress she had bought years before but never had the courage to wear. She hung it carefully in the wardrobe, not for some future special occasion, but simply because she wanted to see it there, a promise of possibilities. And for the first time in years, when she went to bed, she didn't force herself to sleep to escape painful thoughts. Instead, she remained awake for a few minutes, savoring the sensation of being truly alive, truly present in her own life. The invitation arrived on a golden May morning, delivered personally by Henri, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that Madeleine had never seen in him. It was an elegant card, printed on cream paper with embossed letters. Light After Fire. Photographic exhibition by Henri Moreau. Galerie Montparnasse. May 15th, 1945, 7 p.m. "It's my first solo exhibition," Henri explained, his hands slightly trembling as he held the invitation. "And there's something I want to show you there." Madeleine studied the card, feeling the paper's quality, the letter's elegance. There was something deeply moving about holding in her hands the materialization of dreams by someone she had learned to. The word still resisted being formed completely, but her heart already knew it. "I'll be there," she said simply, but Henri could hear in those two words all the weight of a promise. The days preceding the exhibition passed in a kind of dreamy expectation. Madeleine found herself constantly thinking about the event, imagining Henri explaining his photographs to strangers, sharing the stories behind each image. There was pride in those thoughts, a feeling she had forgotten she could feel for another person. On the afternoon of the 15th, she prepared with a care that bordered on ritual. She chose the green dress she had taken from the drawer weeks before, a deep emerald tone that enhanced the newly discovered color in her cheeks. She left her hair loose, only with a small delicate clip that had belonged to her mother. She wore no jewelry besides the simple ring she had bought to replace the engagement ring, a symbol of her newly conquered independence. The Galerie Montparnasse was on a tree-lined street that Madeleine knew by sight but had never explored. The building was elegant but not intimidating, with large windows that allowed natural light to mix with interior lighting. When she arrived, at 7 o'clock sharp, there was already a small crowd forming at the entrance. Henri saw her immediately, as if he had been waiting specifically for her. He approached with a smile that mixed genuine joy with artist's nervousness at his first major exhibition. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice. "I promised I would," Madeleine responded. "Besides, I wouldn't miss this for anything in the world." He offered his arm, a gallant gesture that made her smile, and guided her inside the gallery. The space was larger than it seemed from outside, with white walls that served as perfect frames for Henri's photographs. There were approximately 30 images, all in black and white, all telling silent stories of humanity amid chaos. Madeleine walked slowly among the photographs, studying each one with the attention they deserved. She recognized some of the images she had seen in Henri's studio, but seeing them here, framed and professionally lit, was a completely different experience. Each photograph gained a new dimension, an importance that spoke not only of Henri's technical skill, but of his capacity to find beauty and dignity even in the most difficult circumstances. It was when she reached the back wall that Madeleine stopped abruptly, her breathing becoming faster. There, framed in dark oak and illuminated by a dedicated spotlight, was her photograph. But it wasn't just her photograph. It was an enlarged version, printed with such quality that every detail of her expression was preserved with crystalline clarity. A small plaque beside the frame said simply, "Rebirth, Portrait of a Free Woman." Madeleine felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of being seen, of being understood, of having her journey honored in such a public and beautiful way. Henri appeared beside her, clearly nervous about her reaction. "I hope you don't mind," he said softly. "I couldn't do an exhibition about light after fire without including the most beautiful transformation I've had the privilege to witness." Other gallery visitors began gathering with them in front of the photograph. Madeleine heard fragments of conversations. "What strength in that woman's eyes. There's an entire story in that image. It's the most powerful photo in the exhibition." An art critic from a local newspaper approached Henri for an impromptu interview. Madeleine heard him explain that the photograph represented the exhibition's central theme, humanity's capacity to find light even after the darkest periods. "This woman," Henri said, his eyes finding Madeleine's through the small crowd, "she taught me that starting over isn't returning to what we were before. It's discovering who we always were, beneath all the layers of expectations and disappointments. The night passed like a golden dream. Meline found herself talking with strangers about art, about photography, about war and reconstruction. She discovered she had opinions, perspectives, that her voice had value when applied to topics beyond her own pain. When the gallery began to empty, around 10 o'clock, Henri and Madeleine found themselves alone in front of her photograph. "How does it feel seeing yourself like this?" he asked. Madeleine studied the image for a long moment. She saw there a woman she recognized, but who also seemed new. There was strength in the posture, serenity in the gaze, a kind of beauty that came from within and radiated outward. "I feel real," she finally said. "For the first time in years, I feel completely real." Henri nodded, understanding perfectly. And when they left the gallery together, walking through the streets of Montparnasse under the soft light of street lamps, both knew that something fundamental had been celebrated that night. Not just Henri's talent or the beauty of his photographs, but the possibility of rebirth that exists within every person, waiting only for the right moment to emerge in all its glory. The summer of 1945 brought with it a sense of infinite possibilities. Paris celebrated the official end of the war, and the streets filled with an energy that seemed to contaminate all the city's inhabitants. For Madeleine and Henri, that atmosphere of renewal echoed perfectly the personal transformations both had experienced. Henri's exhibition had been a greater success than he ever dared dream. 3 of his photographs were acquired by private collectors, and he had received a proposal to document the reconstruction of cities in Normandy. But it was Madeleine's portrait that generated the most interest, not just from buyers, but from people who had been touched by the story the image told. On a particularly hot July afternoon, while walking along the Seine's banks, Henri asked a question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Madeleine, have you ever thought about traveling? Not just strolls through Paris, but real trips, seeing new places, meeting different people?" She stopped, surprised by the question. During the years of waiting, traveling had been unthinkable. How could she leave Paris when Pierre might return at any moment? But now, "I never seriously considered it," she admitted. "Where would you like to go?" "There's a commission waiting for me in Provence," Henri said, clearly nervous, "documenting how rural communities are adapting to post-war life. It would be a trip of a month, maybe 2. He hesitated, then continued hurriedly. "I'd like you to come with me. Not as... I don't want to presume anything, but as a companion, as a friend, as the person whose company I value most in the world." Madeleine felt something warm expand in her chest. The idea of traveling with Henri, of waking in new places, of seeing France beyond Paris through his eyes, and through her own renewed eyes, was simultaneously terrifying and exciting. "Henri," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you first." They sat on a bench near the river, where the sound of flowing water created a soft soundtrack for confessions. With Pierre, we were engaged, but always very proper. I never really lived with a man, never shared true intimacy with anyone." She paused, feeling her cheeks blush. "I don't know how to be the companion you deserve." Henri took her hands in his, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Madeleine, do you think I have experience building something true with someone? Marie and I were young, impulsive. We had passion, but not true knowledge of each other." He looked directly into her eyes. "What we have is different. It's built on friendship, on respect, on conscious choice. I'm in no hurry for anything. We have time to discover everything together." The trip to Provence became a revelation. They rented 2 separate rooms at an inn in Aix-en-Provence, but spent their days together, exploring local markets, talking with artisans, watching Henri work with a dedication that made her admire him even more. It was during that trip that Madeleine discovered she had a natural eye for composition. Henri began asking her opinion on framing, and gradually she became something between assistant and collaborator. Her suggestions were frequently better than his initial ideas, and she discovered she had a special intuition for capturing moments of genuine human interaction. One night, after a particularly long day photographing a harvest festival, they were sitting in the inn's small garden sharing a bottle of local wine. Henri was organizing the day's photographs when he stopped at a specific image. "Look at this," he said, showing her a photograph she had suggested. An elderly couple dancing, their hands intertwined, faces turned toward each other with an intimacy that spoke of decades of companionship. "It's beautiful," Madeleine agreed. "They know something most of us are just learning." "What's that?" "That true love isn't about the intensity of the beginning. It's about choosing to continue choosing day after day, even when, especially when, it's not easy." Henri looked at her with an expression she had learned to recognize. It was as if he were seeing layers of her that she herself didn't know existed. "Madeleine," he said softly, "you know I'm falling in love with you, don't you?" The question didn't take her by surprise. She had felt the change in his looks, in the way his hands lingered when they accidentally touched, in the manner he said her name as if it were a prayer. "I know," she said, "and you know I'm falling in love with you, too." There were no dramatic kisses under the stars, no overwhelming promises. Instead, they simply sat closer on the garden bench, their hands finding each other naturally, and remained like that until the first lights of dawn began tinting the sky pink. Their love grew like the plants in the inn's garden, slowly, carefully, creating deep roots before showing its flowers. And when they finally returned to Paris at summer's end, both knew they had found something worth a lifetime of careful cultivation. At Café Étoile, Suzanne received them with a smile that seemed to say she had been waiting for that moment for months. The table by the window no longer belonged only to Madeleine. Now it was the shared territory of two people who had learned that the best way to heal old wounds is to create new stories. The autumn of 1946 brought changes that would have seemed impossible just a few years before. Henri had sold his small attic studio and rented a larger space on the Rive Gauche, with enough rooms to serve both as a photographic laboratory and living space for two people. Madeleine, after weeks of careful consideration, decided to leave her apartment on Rue des Martyrs, that sanctuary of memories that had become more prison than refuge. The decision to live together wasn't taken lightly. Both had been hurt in different ways by the past, and they knew that building a shared life would require more than just mutual affection. It would require courage, patience, and the willingness to be vulnerable in ways neither had experienced before. The new apartment was on the third floor of a light stone building near the Luxembourg Gardens. Large west-facing windows captured the golden light of afternoons, and there was enough space for each to maintain their individuality within the union. Henri installed his photographic laboratory in the back room, while Madeleine claimed a small sunny room where she established a kind of atelier. She had discovered, to her own surprise, an aptitude for watercolor that had remained dormant for decades. The first morning they woke under the same roof was marked by an almost reverent delicacy. Henri prepared coffee while Madeleine arranged fresh flowers she had bought at the market. There was no urgency, no unbridled passion, only the deep satisfaction of two people who had chosen to build something lasting. "How does it feel?" Henri asked, serving coffee in two blue porcelain cups that Madeleine had brought from her old apartment. "Like I'm home for the first time in my life," she responded, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. "Not just in this place, but with myself, with who I became." The life they built together developed its own rhythms. Henri worked during mornings, taking advantage of natural light to develop photographs or plan new series. Madeleine used that time to paint or read, often sitting by the window with a poetry book open in her lap. Afternoons were reserved for shared activities, long walks, gallery visits, endless conversations about art, politics, philosophy, all the topics that people in love discuss when they have the certainty they have enough time to explore every nuance. Café Étoile remained a central point in their lives, but with completely transformed meaning. Where before Madeleine went to wait, now they went to celebrate present life. Suzanne watched these transformations with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a small but profound miracle unfold before her eyes. It was on one of those café afternoons during the winter of 1947 that Pierre Dubois finally appeared. Madeleine saw him first, a familiar figure crossing the street, visibly thinner and older than in her memories. For an instant her heart beat faster, not from love or nostalgia, but from something resembling scientific curiosity. It was like watching a ghost materialize. Interesting, but no longer terrifying. Pierre entered the café and saw her immediately. Henri was in the laboratory developing photographs, so she was alone, reading a Virginia Woolf book while sipping jasmine tea. Pierre approached hesitantly, clearly surprised to find her different from what he expected. "Madeleine," he said, his voice laden with an emotion she couldn't identify. She raised her eyes from the book calmly, studying the face of the man who had dominated her thoughts for so long. There was a smallness in him she had never noticed before, a way of inclining his shoulders that suggested defeat, eyes that avoided direct contact. "Pierre," she said simply, closing the book but keeping her finger marking the page. He remained standing, clearly expecting her to invite him to sit. When he realized this wouldn't happen, he pulled a chair from the neighboring table without asking permission. "You're different," he said, and there was confusion in his voice. "I am. You don't seem surprised to find me here. Suzanne told me you still came here. I waited a long time to have the courage to come." Madeleine nodded, understanding. Suzanne had developed over the years an impressive information network. Nothing happened in the neighborhood without her knowing. "What do you want, Pierre?" The direct question clearly took him off guard. He had prepared, obviously, a long speech full of justifications and pleas. But faced with Madeleine's imperturbable serenity, words seemed to flee from him. "I thought we could talk. About the past. About possibilities." Madeleine took a sip of tea, observing him over the cup's rim. There was a hint of compassion in her gaze, but no vestige of the devastating pain that man had caused. "Pierre, there's nothing in the past that needs to be revisited, and there are no possibilities between us. You made your choices 4 years ago. I made mine since then. But I returned. I left everything to return for you. You returned because you had nothing left. That's very different." The gentle brutality of her words struck him visibly. Pierre looked around the cafe as if seeking support, but found only Suzanne, who watched him with an expression that wasn't exactly hostile, but definitely wasn't friendly. "The woman from Ukraine died, and I realized I had never stopped loving you." Madeleine briefly closed her eyes, not from pain, but from weariness at his predisposition for drama. "Pierre, you don't love me. You never loved me. You love the idea of having someone waiting for you, the guarantee that your importance will always be recognized. But that's not love. That's selfishness." At that moment, Henri entered the cafe. He immediately saw the tension at Madeleine's table and the presence of the stranger. He approached with calm but determined steps. Madeleine looked at him and smiled, a genuine smile, full of relief and affection. "Henri, this is Pierre Dubois. Pierre, this is Henri Moreau. My companion." The word companion had a devastating effect on Pierre. He looked from Madeleine to Henri, clearly processing what this meant. Henri extended his hand politely, but there was firmness in his grip and gaze. "Monsieur Dubois," Henri said, "I've heard much about you." Pierre didn't respond to the greeting. Instead, he turned to Madeleine with an expression of wounded incredulity. "So that's it? You simply moved on?" "Yes," Madeleine said with devastating simplicity. "I moved on, as you should have done." Pierre stood abruptly, overturning the chair. Everyone in the cafe turned to observe the scene. "You'll regret this," he said, but the words sounded empty, even to himself. "No," Madeleine responded. "The only thing I regret is having wasted so much time waiting for someone who was never worth the wait." Pierre left the cafe like a storm that quickly dissipates. Madeleine and Henri remained seated in silence for a few moments, processing what had happened. "How do you feel?" Henri finally asked. Madeleine considered the question carefully. "Free," she said. "Complete. Finally free." And it was true. The last ghost had been confronted and dismissed. What remained was only the future, bright and full of possibilities she had learned to embrace with both hands. The months following the encounter with Pierre at the cafe were marked by a tranquility Madeleine had thought impossible. The autumn of 1948 arrived with particularly vibrant colors, as if nature wanted to celebrate her inner peace. She and Henri had developed a comfortable routine that balanced independence and companionship, individual work and shared projects. It was on a golden October morning that the last piece of Madeleine's past demanded resolution. Henri had left early for a photo session at the Montmartre markets, and Madeleine was in the Luxembourg Gardens, making sketches for a series of watercolors when a familiar shadow fell over her notebook. She raised her eyes and found Marcel Fontaine, Pierre's editor, standing before her with a grave expression. "Madeleine," he said, removing his hat, "may I speak with you?" She closed the sketch notebook and gestured to the bench beside her. Marcel seemed to have aged considerably since the last time she had seen him, and there was something in his eyes that suggested serious news. "It's about Pierre," he said without preamble. Madeleine felt a stab of something that was no longer pain, but a kind of resigned curiosity. Pierre had become for her like a story someone tells about people we don't know. Interesting, perhaps, but without real power over our emotions. "Did he die?" she asked, surprising herself with her own calm. "Yes, last week in Ukraine." Marcel paused, clearly expecting a more dramatic reaction. When she simply nodded and waited for him to continue, he seemed disconcerted. "He returned there after the encounter with you at the cafe. Apparently he tried to rebuild the life he had left, but things didn't go well. The family of the woman who died blamed him for having abandoned the property earlier. There were legal disputes, financial problems." "And the child?" Madeleine asked. "He's fine. He was adopted by relatives of the mother. Pierre, from the reports I received, spent his last months living alone in a cabin on the outskirts of town. He died of pneumonia. Alone." Madeleine processed this information with a serenity she herself found remarkable. There was sadness there, not for Pierre specifically, but for the universal human tragedy of a wasted life, of choices that lead to isolation and bitterness. "Why did you come to tell me?" she asked. Marcel hesitated, then removed a yellowed envelope from his coat's inner pocket. "He wrote this shortly before dying. He asked that it be delivered to you if anything happened to him." Madeleine looked at the envelope as if it were a poisonous snake. There was something disturbing about the idea that Pierre had tried, even in his death, to establish one last connection with her. "I don't want to read it," she finally said. "Madeleine." "No." Her voice was firm, without a trace of hesitation. "Whatever he wrote, whether apology or last manipulation attempt, has no place in my life. He lost the right to my attention long ago." Marcel looked at her with a mixture of surprise and something that could be admiration. "Are you sure?" "He said it was important." "Marcel," Madeleine turned to face him completely. "For years I lived waiting for his words, his letters, his promises, his explanations. Now I have a life built on my own choices, my own strength. Pierre's last words can't add anything to that." She stood, gathering her drawing materials with calm and decisive movements. "If you feel you must do something with that letter, donate it to some historical archive. Perhaps it will be useful for someone studying the effects of war on personal relationships, but for me, Pierre Dubois is already just a lesson learned." Marcel remained sitting on the bench, still holding the envelope, while Madeleine walked away. When she was almost at the park's exit, he called her one last time. "Madeleine!" He said he still loved you. She stopped and turned, and Marcel could see on her face an expression of genuine compassion, but not for herself, for the dead man who had persisted in his illusions until the end. "Marcel, Pierre never loved me. He loved the idea of me, the concept of having someone always available to validate his importance. True love would have meant respecting my choice to move on. True love would have meant leaving me in peace." When she arrived home, Henri was waiting with prepared tea and fresh flowers on the table. He immediately saw that something had happened but didn't press. Instead, he simply opened his arms, and she took refuge in them with the sensation of arriving at port after a storm. "Pierre died," she said against his chest. Henri held her a little tighter, but said nothing. He knew any words would be inadequate for the moment. "Marcel brought a letter from him. I didn't want to read it." "You did well," Henri said softly. "The past has already said everything it had to say." That night, lying together in bed, Madeleine looked at the ceiling and reflected on the strangeness of feeling relieved by the death of someone who had been so important in her life. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply the recognition that the last possibility of disturbance to her peace had been removed. "Henri," she whispered in the darkness. "Yes? Promise me that if something happens to me, you won't spend years waiting for me to return. Promise you'll move on, that you'll find happiness again." He turned to face her, his eyes shining in the soft light entering through the window. "I promise," he said, "but only if you promise the same." "I promise." And in those promises exchanged in the night's intimacy, both understood they had created something completely different from what either had known before, a love that wasn't based on possession or dependence, but on free choice renewed each day. 10 years had passed since that devastating winter afternoon when Henri showed Madeleine the photograph that would change her life forever. It was now spring 1953, and Paris bloomed with an exuberance that seemed to echo the fullness Madeleine had found in her own existence. Café Étoile remained practically unchanged, a comforting constant in a world in constant transformation. Suzanne, now 70, had passed most of her responsibilities to a young niece, but still appeared every morning to supervise the café and chat with regular customers who had become her chosen family. Madeleine and Henri maintained the ritual of their evening visits to the café, but now they always arrived together, walking hand in hand through familiar streets like a couple who had learned that lasting happiness is built through thousands of small shared moments. The table by the window was still theirs, but in a completely transformed way. Where before there had been anguished waiting, now there were animated conversations about the projects they were developing. Henri had established himself as one of Paris's most respected documentary photographers, his exhibitions attracting international attention. Madeleine had discovered not only talent for watercolor, but also a natural aptitude for writing about art, her critiques being regularly published in cultural magazines. It was on one of those golden May afternoons that Suzanne approached their table carrying something special. A bouquet of red roses, fresh and fragrant, which she placed in a vase at the table's center. "Where did these come from?" Madeleine asked, delicately touching one of the petals. Suzanne smiled with the mysterious air of someone keeping a sweet secret. "An anonymous admirer," she said. "He said they were to celebrate 10 years of, as he put it, found freedom." Madeleine and Henri looked at each other, understanding immediately. There weren't many people who knew the complete story of her transformation, but those who did had witnessed something extraordinary. "Suzanne," Henri said softly, "you've been more than a waitress to us. You've been a keeper of memories, a silent witness to a metamorphosis." The older woman blushed slightly, her rough hands moving nervously over her apron. "You two taught me it's never too late to start over." Seeing Madeleine transform from a woman who waited to live into a woman who lives fully was one of the privileges of my life. That night, as they walked home through streets softly illuminated by street lamps, Madeleine stopped in front of a florist that was still open. She bought a single white rose, not red like passion, not pink like young romance, but white like peace and completeness. "What for?" Henri asked. "For her," Madeleine indicated with her head in the direction they had come from, but Henri knew she was referring to herself. "For the woman I learned to be." In the apartment, Henri revealed a surprise he had been planning for weeks. He led Madeleine to his studio, where he had mounted a private exhibition. Photographs of her taken over the years, from that first transformative portrait to recent images of her work, her laughter, her moments of artistic concentration. "It's the story of a rebirth," he explained, "but it's also the story of a woman who never stopped being extraordinary, even when she couldn't see that in herself." Madeleine walked slowly among the photographs, seeing her own journey documented through Henri's loving eyes. There was a progressive beauty in the images, not just physical but spiritual. Each photograph captured a little more light in her eyes, a little more confidence in her posture, a growing sense of belonging to herself. "Henri," she finally said, "do you know these 10 years with you have been the happiest of my life? Even considering they began with complete devastation. Especially because of that," she smiled. "The devastation was necessary. It was what forced me to discover who I really was, beneath all the layers of expectations and fears." That night, lying together as they had done on thousands of previous nights, they talked about the future with the same tranquility others used to discuss the weather. There were plans to travel. Henri had received a proposal to document Italy's reconstruction, and Madeleine was eager to paint Tuscan landscapes. There was the possibility of collaborating on a book, Henri's photographs accompanied by Madeleine's texts about art and personal renewal. But more important than any specific plan was the absolute certainty that they had built something lasting, something that could withstand the storms life would inevitably bring. The next morning they returned to Café Étoile for their usual visit. The table by the window awaited them, as always, but now Madeleine sat with the confidence of someone who had transformed a place of suffering into a sanctuary of joy. Suzanne brought their usual orders, jasmine tea for Madeleine, strong coffee for Henri, and as a final gift to the narrative she had witnessed unfold, placed on the table the framed portrait of Madeleine that Henri had left at the café years before. The photograph that had marked the beginning of her freedom now rested permanently in the place where everything had begun. "So everyone can see," Suzanne said simply. "So everyone knows it's possible to be reborn." And so, in the perfect simplicity of a Parisian morning, in the company of the man she had learned to love and the woman who had witnessed her transformation, Meline Rouso completed a circle that had begun with pain and closed with fullness. She raised the teacup to her lips, savoring not just the perfumed liquid, but the perfect moment she had created through years of courage to change. Outside, Paris continued its eternal dance of hurried people, dreams being pursued, hearts being broken and healed. But inside Café Étoile, at the table by the window that had witnessed so much suffering and so much transformation, there was a peace that seemed to radiate toward every corner of the small establishment. Henri watched Madeleine with the same look of respectful admiration he had developed since the first day. But now there was something more. There was the deep satisfaction of a man who had been an essential part of someone beloved's healing journey, without ever trying to be her savior, just her companion. "Do you know what impresses me most?" Henri said, looking out the window toward the streets they knew so well. "What?" "How you managed to transform 3 years of waiting into an entire lifetime of presence. Most people would have kept bitterness, would have allowed betrayal to define forever how they see love." Madeleine followed his gaze to the street, where a young woman walked alone carrying flowers. There was something in her posture, a determination mixed with vulnerability, that reminded Madeleine of herself years ago. "Perhaps because I learned that holding grudges is like carrying stones in your pockets," she said thoughtfully. "You think you're protecting yourself, but really you're just making yourself heavier, slower, less capable of reaching beautiful places." Suzanne approached to collect some cups from other tables, but stopped upon hearing the conversation. "Madame Rouso," she said softly, "may I tell something I never told before?" Madeleine nodded, intrigued. "In the first months after you began coming here, I used to cry at the end of the day. Seeing so much suffering concentrated in such a young person, it was heartbreaking. But then, when I saw you begin to change, to flourish," Suzanne smiled, her eyes filling with tears of joy. "It was like witnessing a miracle happen slowly, 1 teaspoon of tea at a time." Henri took Madeleine's hand on the table, intertwining their fingers with the familiarity of an intimacy built over years of mutual trust. "Suzanne is right," he said, "but the miracle was you. I just had the luck of being present when you decided to stop waiting for life to happen and began creating it actively." Madeleine looked at their intertwined fingers, hands that had held letters of unrequited love, that had trembled upon discovering betrayals, that had burned false promises, and that now rested peacefully in the palm of a man who had chosen to love her not for what she represented to him, but for what she was in essence. "Henri," she said softly, "do you know we're happy in a way many people never experience?" "How so?" "We chose each other, completely, consciously, with full knowledge of our wounds and limitations. It wasn't passion at first sight or desperate need, it was recognition. As if two people who had been walking parallel paths finally found the point where the paths cross. Outside, the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, creating golden patterns over the café tables. It was the hour when, years ago, Madeleine used to feel the weight of solitude intensify. Now it was simply another beautiful moment in a day full of them. "Suzanne," Madeleine called, "tomorrow marks exactly 10 years since Henri showed me that photograph. And how do you intend to celebrate?" the waitress asked with genuine curiosity. Madeleine and Henri looked at each other, and in that look passed a silent communication that long-time couples develop. "Doing exactly what we're doing now," Madeleine responded. "Having tea at our favorite café, in the company of people we love, grateful for every moment that brought us here." And in those words was contained all the wisdom she had accumulated. That true happiness isn't in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the capacity to find magic in daily simplicity, in the courage to love again after being hurt, in the daily choice to build something beautiful over the ruins of what didn't work. Theatre epilogue. When they rose to leave that afternoon, Madeleine stopped for a moment in front of the framed photograph on the wall, that image of herself that captured the exact moment of her transformation. The woman in the photograph seemed to look back at her through time as if whispering, It was worth every tear, every moment of courage, every difficult choice. It was indeed, Madeleine whispered in response, lightly touching the frame's glass. Henri held her free hand, and together they walked out of Café Étoile, their shadows blending on the sidewalk, gilded by the setting sun. Behind them, Suzanne waved from the door, keeping in her heart one more chapter of the most beautiful story she had witnessed in 15 years of serving coffee and watching human lives unfold before her eyes. On the street, Madeleine stopped once more, turning to look at the café that had been the scene of so much suffering and so much joy. "Henri," she said, her voice laden with deep gratitude. "Thank you." "For what?" "For helping me discover that waiting for someone who doesn't deserve our wait is a form of betrayal to ourselves, and that loving someone who loves us back is one of the rarest and most precious privileges of human existence." He gently kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become ritual between them. "Thank you," he responded, "for teaching me that rebuilding a life is a form of art, and that some masterpieces are only possible after we completely accept the destruction of previous versions." And so, hand in hand, they walked home through the streets of Paris that had witnessed their love story, not the kind of love that bursts like a storm and devastates everything in its path, but the kind that grows like a carefully cultivated garden, blooming more beautifully each passing season. At Café Étoile, the table by the window awaited the next day, ready to be the scene of more conversations, more discoveries, more moments of a life lived fully by a woman who had learned that true hope isn't waiting for something to happen, but actively creating conditions for beautiful things to flourish. Meline Rouso's story had begun with a weight that almost destroyed her, and had transformed into a life that was, itself, the answer to all the prayers she never knew how to make.